Hi, this is Dark Journalist. Today I have a special episode for you with Oxford scholar Dr. Joseph Farrell. Now, we'll go deep on false UFO disclosure narratives that we're seeing perpetrated by the mainstream media and corporate marketing circles. The question is, are they part of a prefab design that was laid out in a detailed warning by former NASA rocket scientist Dr. Wernher von Braun to his assistant, Dr. Carol Rosen? The new trend of CIA officials starting UFO disclosure initiatives for profit, and the sudden willingness of the mainstream corporate media to hype any and all UFO sightings as a threat, should sound the alarm bell that the forces who built the wall of secrecy and absconded with the missing trillions have a new plan. Are we watching the setup for a false alien invasion, and is it meant to hide what's really happening in space? Let's go ask Dr. Joseph Farrell. Joseph, it's great to have you back with us to discuss the false alien invasion scenario and the true history of the UFO file.
Thanks for having me.
This is some timing we have here.
Yeah, this is some timing.
You got Time and Newsweek, and I'll tell you, Joseph, they're demanding UFO disclosure. Politico, they're like, why is the government hiding files?
Well, you've seen the article about the Oxford professor Young-Hwai Chi.
Yes.
And his theory that, well, the aliens are here and they're concerned about climate change. And I'm thinking, could we get a more obvious Mr. Globaloney agenda than this? Let's get all of the big global agendas and tie them together in one pretty package and put it out there. You've got to believe in ET, you've got to believe in climate change, and here we go, folks.
Wow. Yeah. And hey, Oumuamua is just a big ship going by.
Yeah, it's just sailing through here, you know. Oh, jeez.
That's a good one for Richard Hoagland. We'll have to save that one for him.
For Richard, yes.
But I have noticed, and we've been watching this and tracking it close for a while, first through the secret space program activity and the instant, kind of operation to clone that with kind of junk conspiracy version.
Right.
And also with the UFO thing. Now, I have reports and I have data from 2014 and 2015 where the CIA is trying to still debunk the issue, and they say, you know, all those sightings from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was us with experimental aircraft, and they let out big releases to prove it was them, etc. But then something changed. Somewhere in 2016, we got this unusual mention of UAP by Hillary Clinton in the campaign.
Right.
Then we found that PODESTA, who was managing her campaign, had also been a big sort of UFO advocate. And he'd been working with Tom DeLonge just previous to the setup of the TTSA. So we have this political element immediately around the UFO aspect. Now, it seems to me that that whole system of things got shocked when Trump went in, and somehow that op was left hanging.
Yes.
And we still have the people from that op, like PODESTA, like DeLonge, like Elizondo, pushing some version of it, but without the titular head president to push it with them. And on the other side, we have Trump with the Space Force trying to again grab this reins of that UFO file. But back there, if we go into the history of this, is a very telling story which is well known in independent circles, about Carol Rosen. And what she said was very interesting in that she worked with von Braun and when he was at Fairchild Industries, and we're going to get into all of that. But he outlined a scenario where there would be basically, at the end of a process, a kind of fake alien invasion.
Right.
And what I want to do is sort of walk us through von Braun, how he would have that kind of access to that information, having been the father of our rocket program, basically. And some of the figures around the early development of von Braun, and then now are we looking at the fulfillment of his 50-year prediction.
Okay.
So let's start with this. Von Braun, just a quick sketch, a quick outline of who we're talking about here. Von Braun, who worked with Walter Dornberger, could be called the father of our rocket program,
Right.
in fact. And von Braun, with that element, as you pointed out in your books, working with that Nazi post-war element, they had kind of cloistered around NASA and created their own sort of power block in there, imitating this power structure that they had in Nazi Germany.
Right.
So let's start out with how they had done that and how unusual this factor was for people like Kennedy when he got in.
Well, von Braun, one of the first things that we have to take account of is that when von Braun was brought over here, and I've pointed this out numerous times, at the end of World War II, it almost appears as if the Nazis were driving the division of the spoils.
Right.
So that the United States got the creme de la creme. In other words, the people that were at the very top of Nazi Germany's ballistic missile development program. Von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, Hubertus Strughold in the so-called space medicine, and a bunch of these people, including, as you've pointed out, General Dornberger, who von Braun, once he was over here, insisted that the United States bring over to this country, which eventually, of course, they did. And Dornberger ends up as a vice president at Bell Helicopters. And then another person that von Braun insisted that we bring over, and again, this was done, was a fellow by the name of Hermann Oberth. And Oberth is a very unusual duck, let's put it that way. He's extremely unusual because he was very heavily into the occult. And once he had been brought over to this country, he gave a famous press conference where American journalists asked him, well, Dr. Oberth, how was it that Nazi Germany was able to get so far ahead, in such a short period of time? And his response was, we had help.
Wow, yeah.
meaning, in the context, extraterrestrials.
Yes.
Now, there's no evidence to suggest this other than Oberth's statement. But it is also very unusual that, and I cover this in my book, SS Brotherhood of the Bell, Oberth was involved in some way, we can't really determine how, but he was involved in some way with the Bell Project. He refers to it, as a matter of fact. And in addition to this, we've got to take cognizance of another individual that von Braun also brings over to this country, and that's Dr. Kurt Davis. Mm-hmm. And Davis is, of all of these Nazis that we've got in this country, Davis to me is the most interesting of them all because he worked very closely with von Braun in Nazi Germany. But the interesting thing about him is he's not a rocket scientist at all. His specialty was plasmas and high voltage direct current measurement. Okay? Mm-hmm. That's what he did. So Oberth is this strange connection to the Bell. He makes his ET statements, and then you've got Davis, who's not a rocket scientist, who's a close associate of von Braun, all during the Apollo program. Davis ends up as the senior flight administrator at Cape Canaveral for the Apollo program. So in other words, this is an extraordinarily powerful man inside of NASA. And then towards the end of his career at NASA, this would be after von Braun is retired and then goes to work for Fairchild. Davis ends up toward the end of his stint, right before he retires, in charge of NASA's UFO files. And once he retires, he then becomes the chairman, one of the board members, not the chairman, but one of the board members of a German company called OTRAG, Orbital Raketen- und Transport-Aktiengesellschaft, which had that big preserve in the Congo, kind of West Germany's Area 51, supposedly developing cruise missiles and rockets and God knows what else. Thank you, Mikhail. Thank you, Mikhail Gorbachev, for sharing that little tidbit of information. Right. But which is how we know about it. Mm-hmm. So you've got all these strange people. Davis is interesting to me because not only has he got all these connections, he was also working for the company that is tied to the Nazi Bell Project. Davis denounced one of his co-scientists in that project in 1942 to the Gestapo.
Wow.
And then after Roswell occurs, the American Army reopens his counterintelligence file to vet him again.
Very strange.
Very, very strange. And of course, again, he passes muster and so on and so forth. But you've got all of these Nazis over here. And like you say, what they effectively did was they set up the same chain of command, I don't know how else to put it, inside of NASA that they were operating with over in Nazi Germany. So in other words, all these people are reporting to the same people. Davis and Obert and Arthur Rudolph and Hubertus Strughold are all reporting to Wernher von Braun.
Wow.
Okay. And von Braun is reporting to God knows who. We don't know. And I hold out that possibility. And there's another strange thing that we need to mention in connection with Dr. von Braun. And that's something I point out in my book, Secrets of the Unified Field. It gets overlooked a lot, but it's a crucial part of the story. Because in the 1950s, there was, of course, the famous ufologist by the name of Dr. Morris Jessup. And Jessup wrote his book, and then the book was published, and then Carlos Allende of Philadelphia experiment fame.
Right. And the book is the case for the UFO.
The book is the case for the UFO. And Allende apparently annotated this book, with marginal notes and so on, and sent it off to the U.S. Navy, which was so taken with these notes and marginalia that they reprinted Jessup's book with the annotations of Carlos Allende in a very famous edition of the book called the Varro edition. At the time, it was not famous because they printed it up in a very limited run of like 50 copies.
In-house
by the Varro Company in Garland, Texas, and then circulated this book to the U.S. Navy. Now, the interesting thing is, as I pointed out in Secrets of the Unified Field, two of the people that received copies of this book are in a picture of Wernher von Braun at the Pentagon. You've got all of these American officers sitting around this table on one side. Two of them are the officers that were in charge of the Varro edition. And Dr. von Braun is sitting on the other side of the table, sitting down. All the rest are standing as if he's holding court.
Yes.
And I speculate in that book, and I'm willing to bet good money that he was a recipient of a copy of the Varro edition.
Wow.
Because again, you've got his connection with Hermann Obert. We had help. You've got his connection to Dr. Davis. You've got his connection to Arthur Rudolph, and so on and so forth. And Obert in this case is the most interesting because he was certainly convinced that there were extraterrestrials, and that they were here and helping out. So yeah, von Braun has his fingers into an extraordinary number of these post-war pies that eventually go back to the UFO issue in one form or fashion.
His knowledge base, it's like the greatest knowledge base for this, being right in the heart of it. Let's just talk a minute about his former boss, Dornberger.
Well, Dornberger was von Braun's boss. In fact, Dornberger was the actual head, up until a certain point in the war, of Germany's rocket program. Dornberger was General der Artillerie. He was general of the artillery, and he headed up the branch of what was called the Heereswaffenamt in Germany. It was kind of like Army Ordnance Bureau. And he was put in charge beneath this umbrella organization. He was put in charge of the rocket ballistic missile development program because, they were trying to create a way to carry out long-range bombardment of strategic targets, hence the ballistic missile program. So Dornberger is right there in the thick of things up until about, I think it was 1942 or 43, after the it was 43, I believe, after the British bombed Peenemünde and just, razed it. At that point, the SS took over the rocket program, and that shifted the rocket program into the tender-loving auspices and care of one General Hans Kammler. Yeah. So this goes in so many different directions. But Dornberger would have been in a position to know pretty much everything up to that point in the war that the Nazis were up to in terms not just of rocket development, but probably due to the connections of all of these scientists working on it. He probably would have known about the Luftwaffe's own programs and so on and so forth. We've got to remember, Dornberger was an Army general. So the V2 program was a German Army program. The V1 program was the Luftwaffe program. So you've got all of these programs that were being worked on, and then in circa 1943, the SS takes over all of it.
Wow.
So Dornberger at a certain point then starts reporting to Hans Kammler. He remains head of the V2 program, but now his boss is Dr. Kammler. So von Braun, if you look at him that way, von Braun is networked to just about everybody who's anybody.
Yeah.
In the Third Reich, secret weapons program.
Amazing. Wow. And of course, Kammler, as you've done great research on, deeply involved with the Bell Project.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And dies about 4 or 5 different times.
And dies 4 or 5 different times. Yes. He's kind of like Martin Bormann that way. There's several stories about how he died, which makes me really think, okay, this is classic SS operating procedure. Obfuscate the data and sneak out, to, again, God knows where.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect personally that he probably made it to South America along with the Bell, but there have been reports in more recent times that he stayed in Czechoslovakia, which, boggles my mind. But
wow.
There have been reports to that effect that, he was alive and well after the war in some capacity somewhere.
Fascinating.
Knowing that guy up to no good.
So you've got von Braun and Dornberger in this very interesting relationship, because it is, in fact, it was said that Dornberger had saved von Braun because von Braun had made some comment that had been reported, basically saying that, we should be using these weapons, or that he may have made a comment that, wouldn't have pleased the SS, and someone ratted him out, and Dornberger literally had to intercede to save his life.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. I'm not familiar with the episode you're talking about, but it does not surprise me. There were several instances during the 42-43 period where you had these scientists ratting each other out. Davis being yet another example of this. So it doesn't surprise me, and it doesn't surprise me from another point of view, in that Dornberger was literally on the docket to be called up, in front of the war crimes tribunals for his part in using slave labor in the rocket program. And of course, he gets out of that largely because von Braun, already in this country, insists that the United States bring him over to this country. And he ends up at Bell Helicopter, again, in this weird position for someone like that, in a senior management position, doing, again, we don't know what. But I strongly suspect that Dornberger maintained his contact with a lot of these Nazi scientists, including a fellow, very important fellow at Wright-Patterson by the name of Dr. Walter Lippisch, who was Nazi Germany's supersonic air travel aerodynamics expert, and who is rumored, and I happen to believe the rumors, to have actually constructed a supersonic ramjet type aircraft that was tested right toward the end of the war. So again, eat your heart out, Chuck Yeager. You weren't the first one to break the sound barrier.
Right.
all of this stuff, and like you point out, he's involved in the X aircraft, the X-15, and all of this. So that, again, it makes sense given who he's networked with inside of Nazi Germany, and then who he's networked with over here after the war.
What's amazing is that X-15 still holds the record. Yep. That's phenomenal. It's over 60 years later. I mean, amazing.
Yeah.
So obviously, incredible range of knowledge and incredible grasp of exotic technology on Dornberger's side. Right. We can't help but mention one side thing about Dornberger, which is, strangely enough, one of his proteges was Michael Payne, who is the same Michael Payne who, with Ruth Payne, was housing Lee Harvey
Oswald. Right.
So there's that, again, every time you get around the JFK thing, it's the UFO part shows up somewhere.
Yeah, it's the part no one likes to talk about. It's the UFO business, it's the Nazi business, and, it's there. Mae Brussel was actually the first one to point this out years and years ago, and everybody thought she was mad, you know. But no, she's not mad at all. The connections are there. And to ignore that aspect of things, it's like you say, Kennedy's trying to get his hands on the UFO file and to exercise some control over this thing. And I think you see the same thing going on with Trump. You've got all of this military involvement, and now the U.S. Navy coming out and revising the rules for UFO reportage. I think again, what you're dealing with, quite frankly, is you've got sectors of the government that have been involved in the UFO file, and once they realize that this gives them access to technology with which, let's be blunt, they can dominate the world, then you start thinking in terms of mafia infighting, because the military wants it and the CIA wants it. Everybody wants it, but they don't want anybody else to have it.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So they start fighting each other. And, I think that's what we see to a certain extent with Kennedy. I'm convinced that it's hovering in the background of this whole Trump, Hillary Clinton, Miller, all of this brouhaha that we've been living through.
No question about it. No question. Yeah. I mean, we can cite John Brennan on the CIA side. Suddenly, in 2018, after being CIA director for a number of years and now being out of office to become part of the anti-Trump, oust Trump intelligence push, he's out there saying, we need to study UFOs. This is important, and which is very, very interesting, considering 3 years earlier, the CIA was saying, hey, we did the UFO thing. It was just us. So something changed dramatically there.
Yeah, something has changed. And what it tells me, Daniel, is somewhere along the line, they lost control of it. Because we know that they were studying UFOs since the early 1950s. Right. And it wasn't just the CIA, it was the military as well. So we know that they've been doing this. The real question is who, where is the little ball under the three cups now? They've been playing three-card Monte with us, and no one knows where it is today. And I suspect that this is a huge part of the story that they don't want to talk about. Because, like you've pointed out, we've seen the TTSA thing rise, and the blue chickens, that whole thing. It's everywhere. And now we've got this Oxford professor saying, "Oh yeah, aliens are here, and they're concerned about climate change." And I'm thinking, okay. And now we've got asteroid drills with NASA, and since we're talking about that, let me get to something here.
Okay.
Jim Bridenstine, the director of NASA, and I'm citing here, I want you to listen very carefully. I'm citing an article that just appeared yesterday on Zero Hedge. And I'm quoting what the article says, and then I'm quoting what Bridenstine says. Okay, quote, Bridenstine used the meteorite that exploded over the Russian city of Chelyabinsk in 2013 as an example of just how dangerous these space rocks could be to the Earth. The Chelyabinsk meteor had, quote, 30 times the energy of the atomic bomb at Hiroshima, unquote, and injured around 1,500 people. Just 16 hours after the crash, NASA detected an even larger object that approached the Earth but did not actually land on it. He revealed, quote, I wish I could tell you that these events are exceptionally unique, but they are not, Bridenstine said. Quote, these events are not rare. They happen. It's up to us to make sure that we are characterizing, detecting, and tracking all of the near-Earth objects that could be a threat to the world, unquote. Now, what's interesting to me there, Daniel, is the language. Asteroids don't land on the Earth. They crash on the Earth. They smack into the Earth. Yes. They don't land. Okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the choice of language that makes me wonder just what the heck is going on, because when you go back to that whole Chelyabinsk episode, it occurred in such a weird context. A month before, Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev was on Russian television talking about the need for the Earth to beef up its asteroid defenses. And if Russia couldn't get international cooperation on it, well, they just have to go ahead and do it themselves anyway. And then when he was pressed, well, how are we going to defend against asteroids? Medvedev says, well, we can launch our missiles at it, and blow them up, or we could use other means at our disposal, means unspecified, of course. And then a month later, Chelyabinsk happens, and you've got in Russian law this law that cars have to have video cameras on them for auto insurance purposes. Right. So everybody in Chelyabinsk is filming this thing, and after it occurs, about 2 weeks, then videos start appearing from Russia of people showing the meteor and then something behind it following it. And, the implication of everybody in Russia is, well, somebody took it out. And so here comes Bridenstine in 2019 saying, oh, yeah, and we tracked another large object right at the same time. But it didn't land.
Right. There's a connected dots.
There's a connect the dots for you. Yeah. So something is going on here. And, it goes all the way back to Carol Rosen that, von Braun told her the sequence of events that they're going to use to try and get everybody on board with weaponizing space. And asteroids are the penultimate step, in this program, right before the alien thing.
Right.
So, I'm wondering, okay, Oxford professors talking about ETs and climate change, and they're concerned. And we've got Bridenstine talking about, well, we were tracking another object with the Chelyabinsk thing too. And, if that's the case, why didn't NASA come out and say it in 2013? Why 6 years later?
Right.
And as a drop-in comment, in the middle of a speech that Bridenstine is making at a planetary defense conference.
Right. Amazing. This is it. And what's interesting to me is going to the Rosen scenario, which we'll go through, it seems like both are active right now.
Yes.
Which is unusual. The sequences seems like, hey, we're just going to try them both at the same time.
Yeah. I think what's happening, Daniel, is you're watching them. They've been pushing the asteroid thing for several years: asteroid mining, asteroid defense, and so on and so forth. Now, with this Oxford professor coming out and starting to talk about ETs and climate change, I think we're beginning to see the overlap, in the phases in Rosen's affidavit, where they're going to start pushing the ET meme first in connection with it, and then they're going to transition it slowly to a more and predominantly ET emphasis here.
Right.
And it's clever the way they're doing it, because the way this Oxford professor put it, it's in the context of other global issues that we need to be concerned about. So we're going to use this, in other words, to drive the globalist agenda: climate change, asteroids, extraterrestrials, and so on and so forth.
Right. The language out of the, let's say, the PODESTA push, the Harry Reid, PODESTA, Clinton push, which includes TTSA, Elizondo, DeLonge, and all that group.
Right.
Their big thing is threat. Every
Right.
time they talk, they say threat this, threat that. It's a threat. Got to handle that threat. So they're using the Invasion Playbook.
Yes.
No question about it. We've seen the Savior ET thing pushed at times, but this is a little bit different.
Yeah.
This is like the evil ETs are coming to get you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the way one of my website members put it to me was, well, it's now the asteroid porn.
Yes.
It's the asteroid version of fear porn, and now we're starting to get the ET fear porn thing. And what bothers me, Daniel, is there's not a shred of evidence one way or the other as to whether or not these things are actually threats, because, and let me qualify and clarify why I'm saying that, because these people that are pushing out the threat part of this are not giving us the details of why they think it's a threat. Now, you can go out there and research UFO encounters, which certainly appear to be threatening and which certainly appear to be hostile.
Yeah.
But they're not mentioning any of that.
Yeah. Right. It's almost as if that history doesn't even exist.
Right.
And they just have some secret little information, and they're going to be the ones who'll dole out little by little. Here's the grand poobah authority on the whole thing. Forget about all that research. Forget about all those researchers.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And by the way, it's not even called UFO anymore. It's UAP.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah. We've got to change the narrative, and in order to change the narrative, we've got to drive the terminology. This is precisely what they're doing.
Yeah.
Precisely.
It's amazing too with the terminology, because of course UAP doesn't mean anything.
No.
It's, that's about as flimsy a phrase as you can get. I went through with John Greenwald from the Black Vault a number of inconsistencies that came out of that story anyway. One of the things that grabbed me about all that, and I want to insert here, is that the seeming influence over and over again of Harry Reid. Harry Reid coming in to save the day whenever they got in trouble with a little phrase like, oh yes, I was working on that, and there were other senators interested in it, and oh yes, that program was real in 2007 when it turns out it wasn't until 2008, etc. So Reid, who as the senator from Nevada would be in charge of Area 51, all the appropriations, the secret appropriations, and was not only senator from Nevada, he was the Senate Majority Leader.
Right.
So incredibly powerful position there.
Yes.
And then in the middle of all this thing about all that, him working with Robert Bigelow. So
yes.
What you've got is big power politics and big money.
Yes. Yeah.
And suddenly they want to be the face of the UFO thing.
Well, it stands to reason that they want to be the face of it, because look what else has happened in just the last few months. We've had the FASB 56 regulations that effectively state that the government does not need to disclose anything concerning its finances if it involves national security. So in effect, what they've done is they've taken the whole federal budget black.
Wow.
And that's a nifty way, if you're getting ready, as Catherine Fitz assumes that they are, and I think she's onto something, of using this as a means of pushing corporate warfare, utilizing corporate proxies to handle foreign policy issues that the government doesn't want to be directly involved with. But I also submit it's a handy way if you are front-loading a big, massive UFO marketing campaign. It's a threat. It's a threat. It's a threat. It's a handy way to get your hands on the funding for it.
Right.
And not have to disclose it.
Wow, incredible. That aspect, the keeping all of the expenditures black, of course, came in, and we know that they've operated with black budgets for a long time, but this is above board and in your face and saying, look, we're going to do this. Whether you like it or not, here it is. We're blacking these expenditures out. You won't be able to track them. That's
right.
Yeah.
Right.
The thing is with Reid, in the Newsweek article, I have a quote, and the important part of the quote is just this: that Russia and China, according to Reid, that Russia and the United States, according to Reid, were engaged in a UFO arms race.
I can believe it.
It's a very unusual statement from REID.
Mm-hmm. I can believe it because we've had indications of this. I forget which book it was, but I recorded an instance of an American senator that was taking a train trip through the Transcaucasus region of the Soviet Union in the 1950s. And he looked out as the train was going through this kind of forested area. He looked out his window and then saw this thing, for want of a better expression, rise up above the tree lines and shoot off. And then he's like, wow, you know, and then his KGB handler shows up in his compartment and goes over and very dramatically pulls down the shade and says, oh, you know, don't talk about this, you know, blah, blah, blah. So in other words, the Russians wanted him to see it. And this was in the 1950s.
Amazing.
So there's no doubt in my mind, none whatsoever, that there's been this quiet UFO research thing going on between the two countries.
Absolutely.
And, you know, we think of deep state here. Well, let's not forget the Russians have their own version of that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's big.
Oh, yeah.
So there's no doubt in my mind, plus the fact that you had that famous incident in 1982 as Andropov was the Soviet leader, where a UFO appears over a Soviet flight of ICBMs in the Ukraine and begins the launch sequence.
Wow.
You know, leaving the Soviet crews scrambling, you know, to prevent a launch. And then the UFO turns off the launch sequence and flies away. So you know, if it's a national security issue for us when they do similar things over here, it's going to be a national security issue for the Soviets as well.
Yeah.
And they're going, like the Soviets, they're going to bury that so deeply that nobody other than, very high ups in the intelligence apparatus over there are going to know about it. Mm-hmm. So I think Reid for once is probably telling the absolute truth there. Absolutely.
Wow. Interesting. What's fascinating, we have a history of the intelligence agencies freaking out whenever the American and Russian counterparts meet. Mm-hmm. So Kennedy with Khrushchev, Kennedy said, I don't want any officials, just a translator.
Right.
They were like, oh, that's unprecedented. Oh. He said, no, that's the way it's going to go. Reagan with Gorbachev. And we know that Reagan, it came out through Gorbachev himself that Reagan said, if we have an alien invasion, will you help us? And that Gorbachev said, yes, we will. But Reagan, again, wanted it without anyone but the translator. And then Trump goes to do the same thing with Putin last year. Uh-huh. And everyone freaks out through the roof. John Brennan, former CIA director, they're all out there saying, this is treason. CNN is going through the roof and all the rest of it because he wants to meet with him one-on-one with just a translator. Again, that reaching in by the intelligence community, if they can get between that conversation, they do not want those two forces to meet and talk about this issue.
No, they don't. And let's remember that when Trump and Putin met, they met in a skiff. They met on Air Force One, if I recall correctly, so that no one could listen in. Mm-hmm. Not the FSI, not the CIA, nobody.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah.
but Trump and Putin. And then they gave that very long conference afterwards, which I think is also very illustrative that something transpired there because Putin went on and on about Bill Browder. Mm-hmm. And there was not so much as a word or peep of adverse commentary from Trump. So I think, again, you had an exchange of intelligence there that was, off the books and behind the scenes, and it could have covered anything. And UFOs would certainly be on the top of the list, again, because you had those strange comments of Medvedev prior to the Chelyabinsk incident.
Right.
And if they're tracking this, and then you've got Trump and his Space Force and all of that, if they're tracking this, then to my mind, this was something that they agreed to talk about, but never made it into the press conference. I'm willing to bet money on it. Let's
Wow.
put it that way. And I'm not a gambling person.
Wow, that's incredible. A UFO file and where it stands. We can say this about Trump. I've done a lot of research on his uncle, who worked. The FBI called him in to explore Tesla's papers.
Right.
We know this on record.
Right.
And we also know now, one thing I've studied deeply is his relationship to Vannevar Bush, who was his mentor at MIT.
Yes. Yes.
Vannevar Bush runs the UFO file.
Yes.
John Trump then knows about and actively, perhaps, works on the UFO file.
Right. Right.
Trump comes out and talks often about this relationship he had with his uncle, how they were close, and how he told me about nuclear before there was nuclear and that kind of thing.
Right.
The knowledge level of Trump in relation to the UFO file, therefore, becomes a totally different matter now.
It becomes a totally different matter because what it means, what he's implying when he talks about his uncle. And there's another connection, too, we'll get to in a minute. You know what it is or who it is. But I think it's significant because of that connection with his uncle. In other words, what Trump is signaling, and I believe he's signaling, Trump is very good at hinting and sending messages to people that he knows is going to be read in a particular way. When he's talking about his uncle, he's really saying, I was told things off the record, and I know things that you think I shouldn't know.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that's exactly what he's doing. The other connection that we need to bear in mind with President Trump is Roy Cohn. And Roy Cohn, like you've said in an earlier interview we did on the McCarthy book, Roy Cohn is swamp creature par excellence. And and Cohn, if you look at those Monmouth transcripts, clearly knew something was going on in terms not only of some exotic technology, but in all likelihood some rather interesting financial skullduggery that was behind it. So I would not rule out that Trump actually has two tracks of information coming to him about this stuff. His uncle, who's able to fill in the technical details, especially if he's studied Tesla.
Mm-hmm.
And then number two, the connection that his uncle has with Vannevar Bush, which, you can't get more connected than that. And then this business with Roy Cohn that he was associated with, in his middle age part of his life. So there's these tracks that Trump has to inside information that don't exist for most of us, and they didn't even really exist for President Kennedy other than his brother Bobby and his connection with Roy Cohn and Senator McCarthy. So, this UFO file increasingly looks to me like it's a football in a game, and they're trying to, each team is trying to get control of the ball and move it down the field. And right now, the way I'm looking at it, Daniel, is we've got a huge struggle between Trump and whoever in the military is behind him, or the corporate world, and the intelligence community. And as I suspect the same thing you do, Daniel, that they had a plan, and the plan involved Hillary Clinton being in the White House. And that whole schedule was knocked way off the tracks when Trump won the election. And we're watching the fallout from it.
Wow, fallout is a great term. This is an intergenerational battle.
Yes, it is.
The last major high point was the Kennedy assassination. That's where he reached for it, and they pushed back, and they took it there.
Right.
Or that at least they kept the access away from the executive branch, which was the goal.
Right.
One of the strange things that I've interpreted from reading people like Fletcher Prouty, etc., is that there's a force in this that is related to politics but resides inside the aerospace corporate industries.
Yes.
The Lockheed Martins, the Boeings. And that's what District Attorney Jim Garrison, when he went into it, he ran into these things. They're very, very unusual when just examining a politician's assassination, he got into this aerospace aspect and the NASA aspect too. So this is something that we've really seen the succession of over the years.
Well, let's not forget something else in this Aerospace Connection. You have not only that, but you have Nick Cook's book, The Hunt for Zero Point.
Right.
And he himself records in that book, which again I think is one of the bellwether books in this story. He himself writes that when he approached certain people in the American aerospace defense industry, in Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman or whoever, that he could get to a certain point with them talking about anti-gravity, but no further. And he records his observation that these people seemed somehow to be afraid of something, to say too much. So in other words, he himself encountered this, and of course he traces this influence in his mind back to Kammler and his organization and all of this stuff that the Nazis were doing. So, factor that in for whatever it's worth. I think that he was probably onto something, simply because it was Nick Cook that really broke, for the English language, broke the story about the Nazi bell.
Right.
Because up to that point in time, it had been broken by Igor Witkowski, but all of that material was in Polish.
Wow.
So it was Nick Cook that really put that story out there and made it gain the traction that it's gained. So there's that factor about the aerospace industry. So you've got Garrison, you've got Nick Cook, you've got all of these people. Then you've got Ben Rich's alleged statements. You've got all of these people indicating that there's something in the aerospace industry that makes our current technology pale. The stuff that we know about, pale by comparison. Well, if you've got technology like that, then it becomes possible to fake alien landings or invasions.
Right.
And that should give everybody pause. I think Trump's Space Force thing is, like I said before, it's an attempt to regain and reassert control over this and take it out of private hands. Because essentially what we have right now, Daniel, if you look at it in a certain way, with this aerospace technology industry involved, we've got a situation where we're creating British East India companies for space.
Right.
And, if you look at the British East India Company, it did all sorts of bad things.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And do we really want corporations going out there and shooting at ETs,
Right,
and
right.
so on and so forth? Well, I don't.
Yeah, right. It seems like a bad idea somehow.
It's a bad idea.
Joseph, thank you. Incredible information in part 1 here. Part 2 for subscribers is coming up next week, and it's a bombshell. So go to darkjournalist.com now and subscribe. This is the perfect time. Of course, Joseph's latest book, McCarthy, Monmouth, and the Deep State, just incredible. You can find it at gizadeathstar.com. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining me for this special episode with Oxford scholar Dr. Joseph Farrell on the false alien invasion threat. You can find more special reports, deep interviews, and documentaries at www.darkjournalist.com. You can also subscribe here to our YouTube channel to receive the latest videos. See you soon.